March 3rd, 1949. 8:47 p.m. The Cotton Club on 142nd Street and Lenox Avenue, a legendary Harlem nightclub that had served as neutral ground for business meetings between different criminal organizations since the Prohibition era. The club was closed for a private meeting that had been arranged 2 weeks earlier between Bumpy Johnson and representatives from the Lucchese crime family, who'd been expanding operations into Harlem and who needed to negotiate territorial boundaries and profit-sharing arrangements that would prevent the kind of violent conflict that was expensive for everyone involved. Bumpy arrived at 8:34 p.m. with 3 men, Marcus Webb, his most trusted lieutenant, and 2 enforcers who served primarily as security during high-level meetings where tensions might escalate unpredictably. This was standard protocol for business negotiations, bringing enough force to demonstrate seriousness without bringing so much that the meeting became confrontation rather than discussion. Bumpy expected that the Lucchese family would send similar numbers, 4 or 5 representatives who could negotiate terms and report back to family leadership for final approval. What Bumpy did not expect, what became immediately clear when he entered the Cotton Club's main room at 8:47 p.m., was that the Lucchese family had sent 43 men. Not 4 representatives for negotiation, not 5 soldiers for security. 43 armed men who'd positioned themselves throughout the club in a formation that was clearly designed for intimidation rather than discussion. The Lucchese family wasn't interested in negotiating territorial boundaries. They were interested in demonstrating overwhelming force that would compel Bumpy to accept whatever terms they dictated, or face consequences that no rational person would choose. The Lucchese contingent was led by Anthony "Tony Baggs" Bagliamente, a 44-year-old capo regime who controlled gambling and loan sharking operations in parts of the Bronx, and who'd been assigned the task of expanding into Harlem by forcing existing operators to either accept subordinate positions or be eliminated through methods that would discourage others from resisting. Tony Baggs had brought 42 soldiers specifically to make clear that resistance was futile, that Bumpy Johnson, regardless of his reputation and his decades of operation in Harlem, was now facing an organization with resources that couldn't be matched through courage or strategic thinking alone. The 43 Lucchese men were positioned strategically throughout the Cotton Club's main room. 12 were stationed near the entrance, blocking any exit that Bumpy and his 3 men might attempt. 15 were positioned around the perimeter of the room, creating a semicircle that hemmed Bumpy's group toward the center. 16 were positioned behind Tony Baggs himself, who stood at the far end of the room near the stage where performers would normally entertain the club's patrons. The formation was designed to communicate a simple message: you are surrounded. You are outnumbered 14-1, and your only rational choice is complete submission to whatever terms we dictate. Tony Baggs spoke first, his voice carrying the kind of theatrical confidence that comes from believing overwhelming force has already determined the outcome before any words are exchanged. Bumpy Johnson. We called this meeting to discuss territorial arrangements. But looking at the situation, I don't think there's much to discuss. We're moving into Harlem. We're taking over numbers, policy, loan operations, protection rackets. You can work for us. We'll pay you 20% of what you currently make, which is generous considering your alternative. Or you can refuse, and we'll remove you the way we've removed other operators who didn't understand that times have changed and that the Lucchese family controls this territory now. The 43 men in the room waited for Bumpy's response, expecting either immediate submission or futile resistance that would be crushed through the overwhelming numerical advantage they'd established. What they didn't expect, what would later be described in various retellings of this story as the moment when everyone present understood they'd fundamentally miscalculated, was what Bumpy did at 8:52 p.m. Bumpy Johnson walked to the center of the Cotton Club's main floor, removed a piece of white chalk from his jacket pocket, the kind of chalk used to mark pool tables or draw lines on sidewalks, and drew a straight line across the hardwood floor, approximately 15 feet long, positioned between himself and the 43 Lucchese soldiers who were arrayed around the room. The line was visible, clear, unmistakable, a white chalk boundary on dark wood flooring that divided the room into 2 sections, the section where Bumpy and his 3 men stood, and the section where 43 armed mobsters waited. Bumpy straightened after drawing the line, looked at Tony Baggs and the 43 men who'd been brought to intimidate him into submission, and spoke 14 words that would define the next 13 minutes and would become part of Harlem's criminal folklore for decades afterward. Anyone who crosses this line dies. I don't care how many of you there are. The response from the Lucchese soldiers was immediate laughter. Not nervous laughter, not uncertain chuckling, but genuine amusement at what seemed like an absurd declaration from a man who was outnumbered 14-1, and who was making threats that couldn't possibly be backed up by any rational assessment of force distribution. Several soldiers made comments that were audible throughout the room. Old man thinks a chalk line is going to protect him. He's got 3 guys. We've got 43. Does he not understand math? This is the guy who's supposed to be so dangerous? He's drawing lines on the floor like a child. Tony, you want me to cross the line first? Show him what happens when you bring chalk to a gunfight? Tony Baggs himself seemed more annoyed than amused, viewing Bumpy's chalk line as a waste of time that was delaying the inevitable submission or elimination that this meeting had been designed to accomplish. Bumpy, you're embarrassing yourself. You're outnumbered. You're outgunned. You've got maybe 30 seconds before my men cross that line, and we handle this the hard way. Accept our terms now, or accept the consequences of refusing. Bumpy's response was silence. He positioned himself approximately 10 feet behind the chalk line, his 3 men spread out beside him in positions that suggested they'd discussed this possibility beforehand and had planned for exactly this scenario. Bumpy's right hand moved to his jacket, but not to draw a weapon. Instead, he removed a pocket watch, checked the time, 8:54 p.m., and then replaced the watch in his pocket while maintaining eye contact with Tony Baggs. The positioning was deliberate and demonstrated strategic thinking that the Lucchese soldiers didn't immediately recognize. Bumpy and his 3 men were standing in front of the Cotton Club's bar, a long wooden structure that provided cover from one direction, and that limited the angles from which the Lucchese soldiers could attack effectively. The bar also provided access to weapons that Bumpy had positioned there specifically for scenarios where meetings might deteriorate into violence, weapons that weren't visible, but that were within easy reach if circumstances required them. Vincent "Vinny" Knuckles. Romano was the first Lucchese soldier to cross the line. Romano was 32 years old, had been working for the Lucchese family for 8 years, and had participated in enough violent operations that he'd developed the kind of casual confidence that comes from never having experienced serious resistance to overwhelming force. He stepped across the chalk line at 8:55 p.m., smirking at Bumpy as he did so, making a show of dragging his foot through the chalk to smear the line and demonstrate that the boundary Bumpy had drawn was meaningless. Bumpy Johnson shot Vincent Romano through the center of his chest at 8:55:07 p.m., 7 seconds after Romano crossed the line. The shot came from a .45 caliber M1911 pistol that Bumpy had drawn from inside his jacket during the moment when Romano was focused on smearing the chalk line rather than watching Bumpy's hands. Romano died before hitting the floor, his body falling forward across the chalk line that he'd been trying to erase, his blood beginning to pool on the hardwood floor that had been polished specifically for dancing and entertainment, rather than for containing the aftermath of gunshot wounds. The laughter in the room stopped immediately. The casual confidence that had characterized the Lucchese soldiers' attitude toward this confrontation evaporated in the 7 seconds between Romano crossing the line and Romano dying. The 42 remaining soldiers processed what had just happened. Bumpy Johnson had drawn a line, had said anyone who crossed it would die, and had just proven that the declaration wasn't bluff or bravado, but was statement of enforceable policy that would be applied regardless of numerical odds. But 42 soldiers, all armed, all positioned throughout the room in formation designed for overwhelming force, couldn't simply retreat after one casualty. Retreating would mean acknowledging that 14-1 odds weren't sufficient. Would mean reporting back to Lucchese family leadership that a single old man with a chalk line had defeated 43 soldiers through pure intimidation. The rational calculation, the assessment that soldiers are trained to make about acceptable casualties versus mission objectives, suggested that losing one man was unfortunate, but that pressing forward with 42 remaining soldiers would inevitably succeed. Anthony "Tony Numbers" Castellano was the second soldier to cross the line. Castellano was 28 years old, younger than Romano, more impulsive, more inclined to believe that the first death had been luck or surprise rather than demonstration of systematic capability. He crossed the line at 8:55:34 p.m., approximately 27 seconds after Romano had been killed, drawing his own weapon as he crossed because he'd learned from Romano's mistake about not maintaining defensive posture during approach. Bumpy shot Anthony Castellano through the throat at 8:55:36 p.m., 2 seconds after Castellano crossed the line. The shot was more difficult than the first. Castellano was moving, was armed, was prepared for resistance. But Bumpy's accuracy was unaffected by the increased difficulty. Castellano died clutching his throat, drowning in his own blood, falling across the chalk line next to Romano's body. 2 men had crossed the line. 2 men were dead. The ratio was perfect, mathematical, absolute. The third and fourth soldiers crossed together at 8:56:11 p.m., apparently believing that simultaneous approach would divide Bumpy's attention, and that one of them would survive long enough to return fire effectively. Robert Bobby Stitch Moretti and James Jimmy Clips Sullivan moved across the line from different angles, weapons drawn, prepared to shoot the moment they had clear sightlines to Bumpy's position behind the bar. Bumpy shot both men before either could fire. Moretti took a round through his left eye at 8:56:13 p.m. Sullivan was hit in the chest at 8:56:14 p.m. Both fell across the line, joining Romano and Castellano in the growing collection of bodies that were beginning to make the chalk boundary less visible beneath accumulating blood. 4 crossings. 4 deaths. 13 seconds elapsed since the first crossing. The mathematics were becoming clear even to soldiers whose training emphasized aggression over careful calculation. The psychology that governs armed confrontations involves complex calculations about acceptable casualties, mission objectives, and the point at which continuing engagement becomes irrational, regardless of initial numerical advantages. Military theorists have studied these calculations extensively, have developed frameworks for understanding when soldiers will continue pressing attacks despite mounting losses, and when they'll break contact and retreat. The general consensus is that well-trained soldiers will accept casualty rates of approximately 20 to 30% before morale collapse becomes likely. Poorly trained soldiers or criminals who lack military discipline typically break much earlier, often after losing 10 to 15% of their force. At 8:56:47 p.m. on March 3, 1949, the Lucchese soldiers arrayed throughout the Cotton Club had lost 4 men out of 43, approximately 9% of their force. This was well below the threshold where retreat would normally be considered. Was within the range where aggressive commanders would typically order continued assault based on calculation that overwhelming numerical superiority would eventually prevail. Tony Baggs made exactly that calculation, shouting orders to his remaining soldiers. He's got 4 rounds left in that pistol, maybe 5. He can't reload faster than we can cross. Everyone go at once. He can't shoot all of us. The next crossing came at 8:57:03 p.m., when 5 soldiers attempted simultaneous assault from different angles, believing that Bumpy's ability to aim and fire accurately would be overwhelmed by targets approaching from multiple directions. What they didn't understand, what became clear in the next 8 seconds, was that Bumpy wasn't working alone. Marcus Webb and the 2 enforcers who'd accompanied Bumpy to this meeting weren't simply standing behind the bar watching their boss handle the situation solo. They were armed, positioned for overlapping fields of fire, and had been waiting for exactly this moment when multiple targets would present themselves. Danny Hooks Martinelli crossed from the left side of the room and was shot by Marcus Webb at 8:57:04 p.m. Tommy Bag Ricci approached from the right and was killed by one of Bumpy's enforcers at 8:57:05 p.m. Michael Mickey Ropes Costanza came straight up the center and took a round from Bumpy himself at 8:57:06 p.m. Peter Petey Chains, DeLuca, and Joseph Joey Coins Lombardi were the 4th and 5th in this wave, both shot. DeLuca by the second enforcer at 8:57:08 p.m., Lombardi by Bumpy at 8:57:09 p.m. Before either could return effective fire, 9 bodies now lay on or near the chalk line. 9 men had crossed. 9 men were dead. The elapsed time since the first crossing was 2 minutes and 2 seconds. The Lucchese force had been reduced from 43 to 34, a casualty rate of approximately 21%, approaching the threshold where trained soldiers begin questioning whether continued assault serves any rational purpose. But Tony Baggs was committed to the assault, had invested too much organizational credibility in this operation to retreat after losing 9 men, and ordered the next wave forward at 8:57:34 p.m. "Keep going! They can't maintain this! We've got 34 men left! They're 4! Basic math says we win!" The problem with Tony's mathematics was that he was calculating force ratios without accounting for positioning, cover, fields of fire, Or the psychological impact of watching 9 consecutive attacks fail with 0 survivors. The Cotton Club's layout favored defense. The bar provided solid cover that pistol rounds couldn't penetrate effectively. The positioning limited angles of approach, and the bodies accumulating near the chalk line were creating physical obstacles that slowed subsequent attackers and made them easier targets. The 10th crossing came at 8:58:11 p.m. when Frankie Dice Romano, cousin of Vincent Romano, the first casualty, attempted to avenge his family member by charging the line while firing wildly toward the bar. Romano's approach was more aggressive than strategic, motivated by rage rather than tactical thinking. And his wild firing accomplished nothing except depleting his ammunition before he'd crossed halfway to the chalk line. Bumpy shot Romano at 8:58:14 p.m., 3 seconds after Romano crossed the line, hitting him twice in the chest with the kind of accuracy that suggested Bumpy was completely unaffected by the chaos of the situation. The 11th and 12th crossings happened at 8:58:52 p.m., when 2 soldiers, Carlo Charlie Knife Esposito and Dominic Dom Razor Benedetto, attempted a flanking maneuver that involved approaching from the far sides of the room where they believed sight lines to the bar might be obscured. The maneuver failed because Marcus Webb had positioned himself specifically to cover those angles. Esposito was shot at 8:58:54 p.m. Benedetto died at 8:58:56 p.m. Both fell across the line, joining the 10 who'd preceded them. 12 bodies, 12 crossings, 12 deaths. 4 minutes and 49 seconds since the first crossing. The Lucchese force was now reduced to 31 soldiers from the original 43, a casualty rate of 28%, exceeding the threshold where military units typically experience morale collapse, and where continued assault becomes irrational from any perspective except pure stubbornness or misplaced pride. Tony Baggs was experiencing both stubbornness and misplaced pride. At 8:59:23 p.m. he ordered another assault, his voice carrying the kind of desperate authority that commanders use when they're trying to maintain control over situations that are clearly deteriorating. "We're still 31. There's still 4. We can overwhelm them. Next wave, go!" The 13th crossing came at 9:47 p.m. when Salvatore Salcement Russo attempted what he believed would be a clever approach, crawling across the floor rather than walking upright, presenting a smaller target, hoping to reach the bar before being spotted. The approach failed because crawling across a hardwood floor is slow and conspicuous, provides no real cover, and makes the person crawling completely vulnerable once they're spotted. Bumpy shot Russo at 9:51 p.m., 4 seconds after Russo crossed the line, the bullet entering through the top of Russo's back and killing him before he'd crawled more than 3 feet past the chalk boundary. The 14th crossing happened at 9:34 p.m., and this crossing would prove to be the breaking point that Tony Baggs had been unable to anticipate despite all the evidence that had accumulated over the previous 6 minutes. Nicholas "Nicky Pipes" Gallo was 24 years old, the youngest of the Lucchese soldiers present at the Cotton Club that night, and he'd been watching 13 consecutive attacks fail, with 0 survivors. When Tony Baggs ordered the next assault, Gallo followed orders, but his approach showed the kind of hesitation that comes from men who understand they're being sent into situations where death is nearly certain. Gallo crossed the line at 9:01:34 p.m., took 3 steps past the chalk boundary, and was shot by Marcus Webb at 9:01:36 p.m. Gallo was the 14th man to cross the line. He was the 14th man to die. The elapsed time from the first crossing to the 14th death was 6 minutes and 29 seconds. But more importantly, Gallo's death represented the moment when the psychological mathematics that govern armed confrontations reached their inevitable conclusion. The remaining 30 soldiers, reduced from the original 43, having watched 14 consecutive attempts to cross a chalk line result in 14 deaths, having witnessed a casualty rate of 33% that exceeded any threshold where continuing assault could be considered rational, made a collective decision that happened without explicit coordination or command. They stopped advancing. They lowered their weapons. They began backing toward the exits. Tony Baggs screamed at them to continue the assault. "We're still 30. There's still 4. We can win this. Get back here." But the soldiers ignored him, understanding something that Tony had failed to recognize throughout this entire operation. Winning wasn't about numerical superiority anymore. Winning would require crossing that chalk line. And crossing that chalk line had proven to be suicide regardless of how many other soldiers were available to cross after you died. The retreat began at 9:02:11 p.m. The 30 remaining Lucchese soldiers moved toward the Cotton Club's exits in what started as organized withdrawal, but quickly became panicked flight, as each man calculated that being the first out the door meant being least likely to be shot during retreat. The 12 soldiers who'd been positioned near the entrance blocking escape routes were the first to leave, abandoning their posts in favor of immediate survival. The 15 who'd been around the perimeter followed quickly. Even the soldiers who'd been positioned behind Tony Baggs as his personal security detail began moving toward exits, prioritizing their own survival over loyalty to a commander whose leadership had resulted in 14 deaths for 0 gains. Tony Baggs himself was the last to leave, backing toward the exit at 9:03:47 p.m. while maintaining eye contact with Bumpy Johnson, trying to preserve some shred of dignity or authority, while executing a retreat that everyone present understood was complete defeat. His final words before leaving the Cotton Club were delivered with the kind of hollow threat that losers use when they're trying to maintain face despite obvious failure. "This isn't over, Johnson. The Lucchese family doesn't forget. We'll be back." Bumpy's response was delivered without emotion, stating simple fact rather than making counter-threat. "The line stays. Anyone who crosses it dies. That was true 7 minutes ago. It's true now. It'll be true tomorrow and every day after. You can come back with 40 men or 400. The mathematics don't change. The line is the line." The Cotton Club emptied completely by 9:04:23 p.m., leaving Bumpy Johnson, Marcus Webb, and 2 enforcers standing behind the bar, surrounded by 14 bodies that lay on or near the chalk line that had been drawn at 8:52 p.m. The entire confrontation, from the moment Vincent Romano first crossed the line until the moment the last Lucchese soldier fled through the exit, had lasted 9 minutes and 16 seconds. But the count that mattered, the count that would be repeated in every retelling of this story for decades afterward, was 13 minutes, the time that elapsed from when Bumpy checked his pocket watch before the first crossing until he checked it again after the last soldier had fled. 13 minutes, 14 deaths. 43 soldiers arrived, 30 soldiers retreated. The mathematics were perfect, absolute, undeniable. More importantly, the lesson was permanent. The Lucchese family never returned to the Cotton Club. They never attempted another incursion into Bumpy Johnson's territory. The story of the chalk line spread through New York's criminal networks within days, repeated by the 30 soldiers who'd survived, and who needed to explain to their superiors why they'd retreated despite maintaining numerical superiority throughout the engagement. The chalk line itself remained on the Cotton Club's floor for 3 years after that night. The club's management made no attempt to scrub it away or refinish the floor to remove it. The line became a landmark, a boundary that everyone who entered the club understood had meaning beyond its simple appearance, as white chalk on dark wood. People would walk around it rather than across it, even during normal club operations when Bumpy wasn't present. The line had been drawn with chalk, but it had been enforced with such mathematical precision that it might as well have been carved into the floor itself. The final accounting of that night was documented in NYPD reports when the 14 bodies were discovered by police who responded to anonymous calls about gunfire at the Cotton Club. The reports noted that all 14 casualties appeared to have been shot while crossing or standing near a chalk line that had been drawn across the club's main floor. The reports noted that witnesses, meaning the 30 soldiers who'd retreated, claimed that the men had been warned before crossing the line, that they'd crossed anyway, and that the deaths had occurred during what could technically be described as mutual combat rather than ambush or murder. No arrests were made. No charges were filed. The official position was that this had been a dispute between criminal organizations, that all parties involved were adult men who'd chosen to engage in violence, and that prosecuting survivors would require witness testimony from criminals who wouldn't cooperate with police investigations. The unofficial position, the understanding that circulated through NYPD precincts where detectives discussed organized crime, was simpler. Bumpy Johnson had drawn a line, 43 men had challenged it, 14 had died, and the remaining 29 had learned a lesson that would prevent future conflicts more effectively than any police intervention could accomplish. The legend of the chalk line became one of the most famous stories in Harlem's criminal history, told and retold with variations that sometimes exaggerated details, but never lost the essential truth. Bumpy Johnson said, "Anyone who crosses this line dies." 13 minutes later, 14 men were dead. The remaining 30 had retreated. The line was never crossed again. The mathematics were perfect. The lesson was permanent. And everyone who heard the story, understood exactly what it meant about the difference between numerical superiority and actual power.